Now, where did this lesson in constitutional history come from? It came directly from the words of the framers in 1787. Impeachment was no strange, arcane concept to them. It was familiar to them as part of English constitutional practice and was part of many state constitutions. It is therefore not surprising that whether to make provision for impeachment of the president became the focus of contention, especially in the context of concern whether, in our new Republican form of government, the legislator ought to be entrusted with such a power. On this latter point, perhaps foretelling the notion that impeachment ought to be a matter of constitutional last resort, Benjamin Franklin noted that it at least had the merit of being a peaceful alternative to revolution. Now, Gouverneur Morris, one of the principal moving forces behind the language that ultimately emerged from the convention, believed that provision for impeachment should be made, but that the offenses must be limited and carefully defined. His concern was very clearly for the corrupt president, who may be bribed by a greater interest to betray his trust, as he wrote. And no one would say that we ought to expose ourselves to the danger of seeing the first magistrate in foreign pay without being able to guard against it by displacing him. Drafts, as they emerged from the convention, moved through one that authorized impeachment for treason or bribery or corruption, and then the more limited treason or bribery, until the critical debate of September 8th, 1787, when, pointing to the then current example of the impeachment of Warren Hastings, George Mason moved to add the word maladministration to that definition. It was in the face of objections from James Madison and Morris, however, that this term was too vague and would be the equivalent to tenure during the pleasure of the Senate, that Mason withdrew his proposal, and the convention then adopted the language, other high crimes and misdemeanors against the state. As Morris put it, an election every 4 years will prevent maladministration. There's no question that the framers reviewed this language as responsive to Mason's concerns, to Morris's concerns, that the impeachment be limited and well-defined. To argue then, as the managers do, that the phrase other crimes and misdemeanors was really meant to encompass a wide range of offenses that one might find in a compendium of English criminal law simply flies in the face of the clear intent of the framers, who carefully chose their language, knew exactly what those words meant, and knew exactly what risks they intended to protect against. Looking back on this drafting history, the 1974 Minority Report described the purpose of the framers in these words. They were concerned with preserving the government from being overthrown by the treachery or corruption of one man. Now, the managers have made fun of the notion that hundreds of distinguished scholars and historians express their opinion that the offenses with which the president has been charged are not high crimes or misdemeanors. Indeed, they suggested, not too subtly, that they must have signed those letters because they were political supporters of the president. To quote them, you go out and obtain from your political allies and friends in the academic world to sign a letter saying that the offenses as alleged in the articles of impeachment do not rise to the level of an impeachable offense. Well, as I understand the manager's position, it is that Gary Wills sold his intellectual soul because he's a political supporter of the president. Stephen Ambrose sold his political soul, his intellectual soul, because he's a political supporter of the president. C. Van Woodward sold his intellectual soul because he's a political supporter of the president. Is it possible instead that distinguished scholars of all political persuasions thought it important to offer their professional opinion on a matter of the greatest historical and legal import because they cared about our country, because they cared that the constitutional process not be debased, Perhaps if the majority members of the full Judiciary Committee had paused for even a moment to consider these issues, if they'd taken even a few hours to debate the question of what constitutional standards should apply, one might now give greater credence to the belated constitutional exposition that they have offered here. Instead, perhaps the majority was convinced by their own rhetoric, by the oft-repeated mantra that impeachment is merely a preliminary step in the process, and that the House need not be concerned with its weighty constitutional duty, and saw little reason to explore the constitutional underpinnings of that duty. Or perhaps they understood that a full and candid exploration would reveal that the proposed articles had no constitutional underpinning at all. Now, the central premise of the manager's argument appears to be this: perjury is an impeachable offense no matter the forum or the circumstances in which it is committed. Second, 3 judges have recently been convicted and removed on the basis of articles charging that they committed perjury. The president committed perjury. Therefore, the president must be removed as well. That premise is simple, but wrong. The first leg on which it rests was removed by the House itself when it voted to defeat Article 2, alleging perjury in the civil deposition. And the House thus rejected the committee's core argument that perjury in a civil deposition warrants impeachment as much as perjury in any other setting. As to the committee's view that the constitutional standard for impeachment requires that all perjury be treated alike, thus the House concluded no, and properly so. And as to the committee's view that it makes no difference whether perjury occurs in one forum or another, in a private or an official proceeding, again, the House said no, and properly so. What then of the manager's argument that the Senate's recent conviction of 3 judges requires conviction on the articles before you today? Again, they simply have it wrong, both as a matter of Senate precedent and as a matter of constitutional analysis. They argue that because a judge is obliged faithfully to carry out the law, just as the president is, each must be removed if he commits perjury or obstructs justice. Judges and presidents, and one would presume all other civil officers if you follow their argument to its logical conclusion, including assistant secretaries and others, must in their view be removed from office if the Senate finds that they committed either offense, removed without a second thought. But judges are different. Indeed, every civil officer other than the President of the United States is different. They're different because before deciding whether to impose the ultimate sanction of removal, the Senate must weigh in the balance dramatically different considerations. First, the answer to the ultimate impeachment question, that is, whether the conduct charged so undermines the official's capacity to perform his constitutional duties that removal is required despite the institutional trauma it may cause, must be very different for one of 900 or 1,000 judges with lifetime tenure who can only be removed by impeachment than it is for one person elected every 4 years by the people to serve as the head of the executive branch. Surely the managers recognize that the Senate here faces a far different question, a far different constitutional issue than it did, for example, when it asked whether Judge Nixon, convicted and imprisoned for perjury, should be permitted to retain his office, or whether Judge Hastings, who lied about taking a bribe to fix a case before him, should remain on the bench. Indeed, a telling rejoinder to the House manager's argument comes from President Ford. On many occasions, we have all seen cited his statement in 1970 in connection with a proposal to impeach Associate Justice William O. Douglas, that impeachment is, in essence, whatever the majority of the House of Representatives considers it to be. But no one really notes the more important part of President Ford's statement 29 years ago. I want to read it to you. I think it is fair to come to one conclusion, however, from our history of impeachments. A higher standard is expected of federal judges than of any other civil officers of the United States. The President and the Vice President and all persons holding office at the pleasure can be thrown out of office by the voters at least every 4 years. To remove them in midterm, it has been tried only twice and never done, would indeed require crimes of the magnitude of treason and bribery. Now, the Senate must ask here whether the conduct charged against President Clinton would in its nature be inconsistent with a decision to allow him to continue to perform the duties of his office. Just as you would ask if you had a judge before you or another civil officer before you, whether the charges are similarly inconsistent with the notion that he or she should be allowed to continue to perform those duties. As former House Judiciary Committee Chairman Peter Rodino, who surely understood the difference between impeaching a president and impeaching a judge, explained during the Claiborne proceedings before this body, the judges of our federal courts occupy a unique position of trust and responsibility in our government. They are the only members of any branch that hold their office for life. They are purposely insulated from the immediate pressures and shifting currents of the body politic. But, he said, with the special prerogative of judicial independence comes the most exacting standard of public and private conduct. A similar theme can be found running through the debate in very recent years over a proposal to establish a process other than impeachment for the removal of judges who fail to live up to the good behavior standard. Both the proponents of the proposal and the legal opinion offered in support of it emphasize that the standard to which judges must adhere is stricter than the impeachment standard, noting that, quote, the terms treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors are narrower than the malfeasance in office and failure to perform the duties of the office, which may be grounds for forfeiture of office held during good behavior. Thus, whether weighing the constitutional and governmental implications of removal or asking whether the accused can be expected to perform his duties, the Senate has always recognized that the test will be different depending on the office that the accused holds. This analysis is wholly consistent with the framers' intent in drafting the impeachment clause, that removal of a president by the legislature must be an act of last resort when the political process can no longer protect the nation. Nothing in the cases brought before the Senate in the last 210 years suggests a different result. Now, the managers also attribute to the president the argument that impeachment can never reach personal conduct. That is not our position. As I told the Judiciary Committee on December 9th when I testified before them, not all serious misconduct flowing from one of the president's official roles is impeachable. Neither is all serious misconduct flowing from his personal conduct immune from impeachment. Judgments must be made, and they must be based on the core principles that informed the framers' decision. But the managers would, in effect, ask you to eschew making these judgments. They speak of perjury and obstruction of justice in general terms, and they argue that they are offenses inimical to their system of justice. No one here would dispute that simplistic proposition.